UFOs, floating orbs of light, strange creatures, poltergeists, and portals to other worlds. Everything paranormal found in one place. A 512-acre ranch near Fort Duchesne, Utah, that is said to be home to a wide variety of paranormal and supernatural activity. And while you might dismiss these as outlandish tales at first, things become a little less clear when you look into the history of the property and the intriguing yet terrifying reports dating back for decades. The plethora of eyewitness accounts, the radical events the Sherman family had to endure in the 1990s, and the eventual involvement of researchers, scientists, and even government officials is puzzling to say the least. Today, we dig a little deeper into Skinwalker Ranch. The history of Skinwalker Ranch spans many generations and over 150 years, and while the more recent phenomenon on the ranch has garnered much more national attention, the history of the ranch and the origins of its name are steeped in war and witchcraft. The Ute and Navajo Indian tribes of Utah and Arizona coexisted in relative peace for many generations, living on neighboring lands and even fighting together against their common enemy. After acquiring horses from the Spanish in the late 1600s, however, the Ute tribes grew more brazen and bold and began raiding other Native American tribes, including the Navajo, stealing their goods and taking their people and selling them into slavery to the Spanish. For generations, the Utes trained warriors, skilled in mounted combat, and fought wars with neighboring tribes. They raided the Navajo, and the Navajo tribes did the same in return. It wasn't until 1863, when Kit Carson and the U.S. Army was tasked with removing the Navajo from their lands in Arizona, that the Ute people would be given an opportunity to completely overpower their traditional Navajo enemies and see them fully defeated. In 1864, with cooperation from the Ute, Pueblo, Hopi, and Zuni Indian tribes, Kit Carson was successful in getting the Navajo people to surrender to him. They were then forcibly moved to New Mexico. Eventually, the Navajo were allowed to return home several years later, but it is said that this event, the driving of the Navajo out of their lands, was what sparked the Navajo to put a curse on the Ute people, the curse of the Skinwalker. In Navajo culture, a Skinwalker is a shape-shifting witch that can take on the form of various animals or otherworldly creatures. The Navajo call the Skinwalker Yi Naldushi, which translates to, "with it, he goes on all fours." The tribes of the Navajo believe that when one of their healers or medicine men decide to use their powers for evil, they become skinwalkers. In order to achieve this transformation and gain their dark powers, they must be initiated into a secret society that requires of them the evilest of deeds, the sacrificial killing of a close family member, usually a sibling. They deem the Skinwalker to be the most threatening and terrifying type of witch one can encounter. They are said to be harmful and violent to any who cross their path. In 1880, when several bands of Ute tribes were located to the Uintah and Ouray Reservation in northeast Utah, the Utes believed the Skinwalkers followed. The Utes believe that Skinwalkers terrorize a large section of northeastern Utah to this very day, including lands surrounding Ute territory. And oddly enough, just east of the Uintah and Ouray Reservation sits a plot of ranch land that the Utes deem to be at the center of the path of the Skinwalker, a place they call Skinwalker Ranch. After the Utes were moved onto the neighboring land, the first Skinwalker Ranch settlers arrived. These were John and Emma Myers, who built a small homestead on the property in 1905. Shortly after, the Locke family settled on the western side of the ranch. This is when the first report of strange occurrences began. The activity on the ranch really began to ramp up in 1906, when settlers on and around the ranch reported hearing loud underground rumblings and explosions day and night. The activity occurred consistently for more than 5 years, all the way through 1911. These events were reported in local newspapers and witnessed by many people in the surrounding areas, but no one could explain their origins. In 1915, the Locke family recalled a visitor that arrived on their property, seemingly out of nowhere, asking for water. The family noticed that the man was wearing appropriate time period clothing, but underneath that clothes, the man wore a bright, shiny blue one-piece outfit. No one was sure what to make of it, but the story goes that the man conversed with the family for a while before walking off and disappearing. He supposedly told the family where not to dig on the property. He was never seen or heard from again. The story was so stunning to the Locks that it was passed down by the family for future generations. The encounter with the strange visitor was followed up by the report from Christopher Locke of the first cattle mutilation on the property in 1930. A few years later, in 1934, Kenneth and Edith Myers purchased a trailer and moved onto the east side of the ranch. From here, documented events on or around the ranch were almost non-existent for nearly 20 years, until the 1950s, at which point the Uintah Basin became a hotbed of reported UFO sightings that lasted more than a decade. Some of these reports included over 100 elementary school children of the Duchesne School witnessing a flying saucer for around 5 minutes. The school children were asked to draw what they saw, and they confirmed each other's accounts. The saucer was really made out of what looked to be 2 saucers put together with 2 jet pipes extending behind the vessel. There was no smoke or vapors emanating from the object, no signs of any sort of propulsion system known to man, even by today's standards. Another incident happened in the air above the town of Roosevelt. The staff of the Roosevelt Standard newspaper, along with numerous other business owners who operated businesses on Lagoon Street, witnessed multiple brilliant silver-colored saucer-like objects floating over the town toward the southern end. Eyewitnesses claimed they watched the object for nearly 5 minutes before they disappeared. Claims of saucer-like objects in the skies over the Uintah Basin continued to pour in all through the 1950s and even into the 60s. Yet while the surrounding Uintah Basin was a hotbed, Skinwalker Ranch itself had little to no documented activity. In the early 1960s, Edith and Kenneth Myers decided to homestead the ranch. Activity around the ranch continues to be sparse and sporadic, punctuated by bursts of activity from 1967 to 1968, with another wave of UFO sightings along with a massive increase in cattle mutilations that began in 1970 and yet another wave of UFO sightings in 1978. By the early to mid-1970s, both the ranch and surrounding areas had experienced their fair share of cattle mutilations, and to many other residents, the odd loss of livestock had become somewhat commonplace. In 1987, Kenneth Myers passed away. After having lived together on the ranch since the early 1930s, Edith Myers was now alone for the first time in more than 50 years. A few short years later, on March 3, 1994, Edith Myers died at the age of 88. Edith's brother-in-law then took possession of the property and sold the ranch at a very discounted price to the Sherman family, who were looking to raise the high-end cattle on the land. It was Terry and Gwen Sherman's dream ranch, the perfect place to grow their business, and at a price they couldn't possibly refuse. Little did they know they were about to walk into a nightmare and introduce the world to the horrors that haunt Skinwalker Ranch. When the Sherman family moved onto the property in 1994, they thought they had found a great place to raise a family and the perfect ranch to raise their high-end cattle. When they arrived at the main house on the ranch, they began unpacking and moving their things in. This is when they got their first taste of strangeness on the property. As the family inspected the new house, opening doors and checking rooms and closets, they noticed that all of the doors had deadbolts on them, some on both the inside and the outside of the door. Inside the house, it only got stranger, with some of the inner rooms and closets having yet another deadbolt on them as well. Outside, Terry Sherman noticed that there were large chains in multiple places around the house. He speculated that maybe they were used to tie up some large dogs. He would later speak with some of the locals about the Myers family who lived here before them, and they confirmed that the Myers had 4 very large guard dogs that they were chained up outside the entrances to the house every night. The family thought it was strange, but brushed it off. Edith Myers was an older woman, living alone the last few years of her life. There were plenty of reasons for an elderly woman such as her living alone on a ranch to feel a bit insecure and overprotective. After hours of unpacking boxes and unloading cattle, their first day on the ranch was winding down. The whole family was standing in front of the porch of the house when Terry noticed something far off in the distance, a few hundred yards away. It appeared to be a wolf at first, slowly meandering its way towards the house. It made a zigzag pattern back and forth as it slowly closed the distance between them. Once it was sufficiently close enough, Terry was able to compare the animal's size to some of the fences on the property. Unless his eyes were playing tricks on him, that wolf would have had to be nearly as tall as he was. The wolf came closer and closer, steadily inching forward toward the family. At this point, it was maybe 50 feet away, and the whole family could clearly see this was no ordinary wolf. It was nearly as tall as Terry. The family was startled by its size, but the wolf showed no signs of aggression, no growling, no tentativeness. It appeared calm and almost inquisitive. One of the children called the wolf over, putting out a hand to pet the beast, and it approached calmly and let the family pet him. After a few minutes, the animal turned to leave and began walking away from the home. The wolf was walking along the metal pens the Shermans had set up for their cows as he trotted away when a curious calf struck its head between two of the metal bars. The wolf slowly approached the calf and then pounced like a lion in the tall grass, wrapping its mouth around the entire head of the calf and trying to pull it through the gate. The calf screamed and squirmed, and Terry pulled out his .357 pistol. He shot the wolf several times from point-blank range. It didn't flinch. Still tugging away at the calf, Terry yelled at his son to grab his hunting rifle from inside. The boy brought the rifle. Terry aimed and shot the wolf again. Nothing. He aimed a second time with the rifle and fired another shot, and the wolf released the calf calmly and stood there for a moment watching Terry Sherman and his family. Terry fired a few more shots at it in an attempt to frighten it off, and finally the wolf turned and trotted away. After ensuring that his family and cattle were safe, Terry and his son took off tracking the wolf. They couldn't just let a giant predator like this roam on their property. It might be a danger to the family, and it was definitely a danger to their prized bulls. They tracked the wolf's prints for a good while across the ranch until they came to the muddy bank of a creek. The tracks were clearly visible in the soft mud here, and they made their way up to the edge of the water, just a few feet away, and then vanished. They found no other traces of the wolf and made their way back home. Terry had shot that wolf half a dozen times, several of those with a high-powered rifle, but the wolf never made a sound. There was not a drop of blood anywhere to be seen when Terry inspected the area around where the wolf had attacked. The only evidence left behind by the wolf was a small chunk of flesh that appeared to have been torn off by one of the gunshots. When the family inspected the chunk of flesh, it looked to be old and smelled putrid and rotten. In the days shortly after the run-in with the wolf, strangely perfect circular impressions began appearing in the ground all around the ranch. These circles could range from a few inches to over 3 feet in diameter, and the grass and earth inside them were compressed sometimes up to a few feet deep. It was as if someone took a giant, perfectly round weight and stamped impressions into the ground. On several occasions, triangular impressions were found in the dirt. The most impressive of these incidents occurred when Terry Sherman came outside one morning to find a massive triangular impression in the dirt and grass. Each side of the triangle was 30 feet long. These impressions in the ground continued to appear off and on for most of the time the Shermans occupied the property. While many of these incidents were puzzling, the family was still cheerful and happy about their new living arrangements. That's why the first few instances of objects disappearing from where they were left and reappearing somewhere else entirely went mostly unnoticed at first. Gwen would set her shampoo bottle on the ledge of the shower, and the next time she went to look for it, it was gone. She would find it some days later in the kitchen or bedroom. She would set her comb down and come back an hour later to find it gone. Again, she would find it then days later in some incomprehensible location. Her scariest incident, however, was just after she had gotten back from buying groceries. She set the bags of groceries on the countertop and began unpacking them and putting them away. After she had finished up and left the kitchen, she returned only minutes later to find all of the groceries back in the bags. She thought she was going mad and decided to keep the events to herself, until Terry had a similar experience of his own. Terry was out on the ranch doing some work with the post hole digger when he decided to take a small break and grab a drink of water in the house. He left the post hole digger next to the hole where he was currently working. He was inside the house for maybe 10 minutes. He made his way back outside to get back to work, and when he got back to the hole he was working on, the post hole digger was gone. He figured perhaps his wife had moved it. When he asked her if she had moved it, she told him no. Terry spent the next little while searching for the post hole digger with no luck. He had given up looking for it until several days later when he was out working on the ranch again, and he happened to glance up in a tree. And sitting on a branch about 20 feet in the air is the post hole digger. When Terry told his wife about the incident, she was startled and decided to explain that she had had several similar incidents herself. The ranch was slowly revealing itself, but while all the occurrences up to this point were strange, the Shermans had barely begun their descent down the proverbial rabbit hole. Another phenomenon that quickly became commonplace on the ranch were floating or flying orbs. There were a few variations the Shermans encountered. The first and most common of these orbs were deemed the headlights. One night on the ranch, Terry and Gwen were in the kitchen and were looking out the window towards the front side of the property. They noticed a strange set of lights in the distance that appeared to be moving. Terry assumed that they were headlights, perhaps on a truck or RV, and that either someone was trespassing on their property or had gotten lost or turned around and needed some assistance. So he hopped into his truck and sped off toward the lights. The lights got bigger as he got closer, but soon he realized that he wasn't gaining distance on whatever it was that was in front of him. The lights seemed to be keeping pace with him. As he tried to get closer, the lights inched their way backwards. He followed the lights further until eventually they appeared to turn off to the side facing the fence along the edge of the property. Terry stopped and watched as the lights made their way towards the fence, and as they reached it, Terry prepared himself for a loud crash and the sounds of wreckage, but they never came. Terry watched as the lights lifted off the ground and disappeared over the fence without a sound. This was not the only time the Shermans would witness these headlights in the distance, as the phenomenon became relatively common on the property. On another night, Terry and his son were traveling west on a ranch road when they spotted a lighted object ducked behind a rock ridge as if to avoid being seen. They managed to sneak around the back side of the ridge, and before the light could hide again, Terry and his son stood up tall and waved their arms at it. The light flashed on and off 3 times as if signaling them, and then disappeared. Gwen Sherman even claims that a pair of these headlights orbs followed her home from work and then disappeared as she pulled up to the house. Another instance of orb activity involved single floating orbs moving about in the air that would turn on like a floodlight and illuminate whole areas of the ranch. These were usually witnessed at night, and the Shermans remember seeing them illuminate the entire fields in what looked like bright moonlight and then die off and darkness would return. Terry also encountered a third kind of orb that glowed a dark blue. These orbs were much rarer according to Terry, but they were given the name the Blue Meanies by the family because when they showed up, if you were to get near one, a great sense of dread and fear would overwhelm you. Also, the Blue Meanies were more prone to interact with people when seen as opposed to simply floating off. What is truly terrifying is that all the orbs displayed sentient properties. It was as if they were aware of your presence and knew exactly how to stay just out of reach. While orbs were a common sight on the ranch, cattle mutilations had long been a part of the strange history of the Uintah Basin, and Skinwalker Ranch proved no exception. The Sherman family had numerous cases of cattle mutilations and cattle disappearances during their 2-year stint on the property. During the winter of their first year of the property, one of the cows had found its way out of the pen. The ground was snow-covered, so Terry followed the cow's hoof prints across the ranch. After a while had passed, Terry found himself in a small clearing surrounded by trees. There were broken branches and tree limbs littering the snow-covered ground, and just near the center of it all was the final hoof print. The trail had led him here and then abruptly ended. There was no sign of a scuffle, no blood, no trace of the animal, and no tracks leading anywhere. Just like the wolf before, the cow had gotten to the spot and simply vanished. Looking around, Terry realized that all the broken branches and tree limbs had come from the trees surrounding the spot where the cow had disappeared. They had been sliced clean in a circle around him. Other cattle had mysteriously died out in the fields just a handful of hours after having been seen alive and healthy with no reasonable cause of death. One cow was found dead with a hole right through the center of its eyeball, but completely untouched otherwise. Another had a hole in its left eye and a 6-inch hole about 1 inch deep carved out of its rectum. The mutilations were not only strange but very costly for the Shermans. Their livelihood was invested in these animals. One early morning, Terry and Gwen were beginning the process of tagging all of the calves' ears. They tagged one calf near the house with its mother watching nearby and proceeded to travel a few hundred yards west to tag another calf. They had brought one of the family dogs with them, and less than 20 minutes after having left the first calf, the dog perked up in the direction of the first calf and began staring and growling. The Shermans were nervous, given their past experiences, and began to head back to check on the first calf. At that same time, the dog panicked, turned, and ran the opposite direction. Once they were close to the first calf, they noticed that its mother was up and pacing back and forth frantically. She also appeared to be limping on one leg. That's when they noticed the calf laying on the ground. Its head and spine were intact, but the rest of it was gone. The animal had been stripped of all its meat, down to nothing but bone. There was no blood on the ground, no sign of struggle, no animal prints or tire tracks, no teeth or claw marks on the corpse. The calf had all of its flesh and innards surgically and precisely removed without a trace. The only thing the family noticed out of the ordinary was a strange chemical odor that was present in the area. During the time the Shermans owned the ranch, cattle mutilations were so regular that by the end, the Shermans estimated that they had lost nearly 20% of all their cattle. The coming months would introduce yet another foreign predator to the ranch. In the afternoon hours of the summer of '95, Shermans had set up a few cameras to help watch over the pens. It was a clear, sunny day when Terry caught a glimpse of an animal pacing around the horse's pen. It was difficult to make out on the screen, but it was definitely much smaller than the horses and appeared dog-like. Sherman watched the camera to see what the animal would do. After a few minutes of pacing, the animal leaped through the bars of the pen and immediately began clawing and scratching at the horses. They bucked and neighed while this thing did its best to attack. Terry quickly ran outside and made his way over to the horses, where he saw what looked like a hyena, but with dark reddish fur. He only caught a few glimpses of it as it dashed between horses. He made his way into the pen just in time to see the creature vanish in front of his eyes. He looked all over for it, not believing what he had just seen, but there was nothing. The only proof Terry had of an attack was some very blurry footage on the security camera and the bloody scratch marks on his horse's legs. The activity only got worse from here. One night, Terry was out walking his property in the clear night air when he began hearing booming sounds coming from the ground beneath him. The sounds grew louder, and the grumbling seemed to shake the ground beneath his feet. As Terry listened, it sounded like heavy machinery being operated directly beneath his feet. He stood there listening to the sounds for a while, attempting to make sense of them, when an even stranger sound revealed itself. This time from above him in the night sky, he heard two men speaking in some unknown language about 20 feet above his head. His dogs went crazy, barking at the sky, but he listened intently. The two men were having a conversation. Fear and frustration welled up in Terry as he shouted into the cool night air. "We can hear you." The voices abruptly stopped for a moment. Then the deeper of the two voices broke into a low, rumbling laugh. The two men continued their conversation while Terry stood stunned. Given the severity of the activity the Shermans had experienced up to this point, combined with the stress of losing their cattle and potentially their livelihood, Terry Sherman had taken to patrolling the property at night with his rifle. One cold winter night, Terry was sitting on his front porch scanning the ranch for any signs of strange activity when he caught a glimpse of some dark object in the sky. He stood up and made his way closer to it. As he approached, he noticed the object looked like a stealth bomber, but it was completely silent and moving at a snail's pace, barely crawling across the sky less than 50 feet in the air. Beneath it were lights of every color moving and scanning the ground. Terry followed the objects as it moved, keeping a safe distance and hiding behind trees and bushes to stay out of sight. He continued watching the object patrol his property when he turned to move and stepped on a small tree branch on the ground. He heard the snap in the silent darkness like a gunshot, but he knew it had barely made a sound. He ducked behind some brush just as the unknown craft stopped and quickly whipped to the side, pointing directly at Terry's hiding place. He stood frozen in fear, praying the ship would not come searching for him. The minutes felt like hours, but eventually the ship turned back towards its original path and continued slowly cruising along, scanning the ground beneath it. Terry watched it as it got further away and eventually disappeared among the trees. While Terry never saw where this unidentified craft came from, the family would be given glimpses many times over the next 15 months. Aside from the stealth bomber-like craft that Terry witnessed on his property, the rest of the Sherman family would witness 3 other distinct types of craft on a more regular basis. The first was a small box-like craft with a white light attached to it. The second was an approximately 40-foot-long ship, and the third was a massive ship the size of several football fields. Some of the craft would emit wavy red rays or light beams as they fly by. The family began to watch these objects through high-powered scopes to get a better view. Many times the family witnessed swirling circular doorways almost 100 feet wide that would appear as bright orange lights from a distance. They would see craft similar to the stealth bomber-like object that Terry saw emerge from these portals. The craft were approximately 40 feet by 60 feet. They would emerge from the orange holes in the sky and fly around the ranch and then disappear back through the same portals. The Shermans noticed that the craft would also emit spikes of light which would hit the ground. They speculated that this may be some sort of navigational system. The family also noticed that these sightings tended to occur during a new moon or when the sky was overcast or stormy and usually came in spurts, sometimes months apart. One night after seeing the strange orange lights appear in a field, Gwen grabbed her binoculars to take a closer look. Focusing in, she was shocked to see a square, lighted structure sitting on the ground in the distance. She only caught a glimpse before the light blinked out, but she witnessed a large, heavy-set individual seated in the object. Just a short time later, it reappeared, and both Gwen and Terry were able to watch it through a 60 times power telescope. They could clearly see a figure standing next to the object. Terry described the person as being well over 7 feet tall and wearing a totally black uniform. It also appeared to be wearing some sort of visor or shiny cover on its face because of the way the light glinted from its head area. The Shermans were terrorized on their own property, and their family and livelihood were being threatened daily. The Shermans were at their wits' end, and their time on the ranch was quickly coming to an end. The entire Sherman family decided to make a run into town to grab some supplies. Terry made sure to check on his prized bulls and double-check the pen doors and make sure everything was secure before leaving. As they were leaving, Terry expressed his worry about his prized bulls and how they couldn't afford to have anything else happen to the cattle. A few hours passed and the family was on their way back to the ranch. As they passed the pens, they were racked with fear as they saw that all of their bulls were gone. They all began to frantically search the property for the bulls that had been securely locked in their pens just hours earlier. At the center of all the pens was a metal shipping container that had been left on the property unused for many years. While the family searched elsewhere, Terry decided to climb up on top of the container and look inside through a hole in the ceiling. To his surprise, all of his prized bulls were locked inside. Terry grabbed a flashlight and began looking around inside. All of his bulls were packed in tightly, shoulder to shoulder with practically no room left in the trailer. All of them were calm and silent as if in a trance. Terry shouted to his family, "They're over here!" And the bulls suddenly woke from their trance and were thrown into immediate panic, kicking and swarming around the confined area. Terry ran around to the front of the container and began looking for a way to open it. Then he noticed a latch that was tied shut with some metal wire. After spending a while to unravel the metal knot and unlatch the door, he was finally able to get the bulls free. Several hours later, the Shermans had finally corralled the last bull and gotten them back into their pens. After settling down, they realized that the metal knot that had been tied on the door latch was old and rusted and clearly hadn't been touched in years. The cobwebs were still on the door and on the inside of the crate, and there was no chance someone could have gotten that many bulls to voluntarily set foot inside a tiny enclosed space with so many other bulls. Later on, Terry would realize that the pens that held his bulls had become magnetized. They stayed that way for several weeks before returning to normal. The final straw for the Shermans came in 1996, nearly 2 years after they purchased the property. Terry was outside patrolling his property at night, as had become the norm after all that had happened to the family, when he saw one of the rare blue orbs, nicknamed the Blue Meanies, floating across his property not too far off from him. Having had enough of all this, the rancher sent his dogs off into the woods to chase the orb. He heard the dogs barking slowly fade as they got further away, until suddenly he heard several loud yelps and then dead silence. Not sure what had happened to his dogs, but too afraid to venture out so far in the other night, Terry went inside and went to bed. In the morning, he went out to check for the dogs in the direction that he last saw them heading. Eventually, he stumbled upon an area with 3 scorch marks on the ground and 3 round greasy lumps of what appeared to be flesh left behind. There was no signs of the dogs. The Shermans were done with the ranch and quickly put it up for sale. However, they didn't want to just sell the property to some unknowing person and leave them to suffer on the ranch like they had. Later that year, in 1996, they were put in touch with billionaire Robert Bigelow, who had recently founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, or the NIDS. NIDS was interested in exploring extraterrestrial and supernatural phenomenon from a scientific perspective and attempting to either disprove the claims or find hard scientific evidence of their existence. Robert Bigelow offered to purchase the ranch from the Shermans for $200,000. This was noticeably less than the Shermans had paid for their property, but they chose to accept the offer anyway. On their last day on the ranch, the Shermans spent time rounding up cattle and were exhausted by evening time. They locked up, put the kids to sleep, and headed off to bed. The next morning, they woke to find their bedding covered with blood. Both Terry and Gwen had had 1/8 inch deep scoop marks in the same place on their right thumbs. The ranch had managed to torment them one last time. The Sherman family moved on, and PhDs and scientists flooded the ranch as the NIDS team moved in. Security was hired, the ranch was put on lockdown from the public, and Bigelow began gathering data. The NIDS team was composed of experts in a wide variety of fields, but none of them were prepared for what they would encounter on the ranch. When the NIDS team took over the ranch, their first objective was to look for realistic explanations for the claims of activity that were made by the Shermans. The team ran every test imaginable. They checked the soil for the presence of unnatural metals or minerals, scanned the ranch for traces of radiation, tested the nearby water sources, checked the ranch for ultra-low or ultra-high-end sound frequencies, and even went so far as to check for specific types of plants or pollen that can cause hallucinations. Nothing irregular was found on the property. NIDS then interviewed the Sherman family and ran several psychological tests on them to verify their mental health. The team also cross-checked the family's stories with other potential witnesses or similar claims made in the area. Everything was scrutinized, but at the end of the day, it was determined that the Shermans were mentally sound and were telling the truth. The NIDS team blanketed the ranch with every type of data gathering instrumentation they could. Thermometers, night vision cameras, trap cameras, seismometers. The whole ranch was under constant and complete surveillance. There were patrolling guards 24/7. Guard dogs were kept on the property as they seemed to be sensitive to the activity and could alert the team to nearby events. The team also had an arrangement with the Sherman family to keep some of their cattle on the ranch for experimentation purposes. Almost immediately, the team experienced their first cattle mutilations. What was extremely common for the Shermans quickly became commonplace for the NIDS team as well. From 1996 until around 2000, the ranch had multiple cattle mutilations under very strange circumstances. Cows would have ears sliced clean off or eyeballs removed cleanly, and as always, there were no signs of struggles or animal attack. No blood anywhere, and often there was a blue, unidentifiable liquid or goo found on the dead cows. Even with equipment set up everywhere to track activity, there was never anything caught on camera to explain these cattle mutilations. The team also ran tests on the blue liquid, but were never able to determine what it was or its source. Alongside the mutilations, the strange circular and triangular impressions found in the ground that the Shermans had experienced many times took on another form. During the wintertime, the streams and creeks on the property would freeze over, and in many instances, NIDS team members would come across perfect circles carved out of the ice. Some of these circles were less than an inch deep and looked more like impressions in the ice, while others were 2 or more inches of ice completely removed in a perfect circle with the running water visible underneath. These occurred relatively regularly, and even with all the equipment on the property, no sign of a source for the strange circles was ever discovered. NIDS researchers were puzzled at the events occurring right in plain sight, but nothing could have prepared them for the night that they first encountered the yellow-eyed beasts. Not only was the encounter baffling and unsettling, it was a new phenomenon that the Shermans had never reported seeing. Several NIDS members were out patrolling the property at night when they saw what looked to be a pair of tiny yellow lights up in a tall tree. 100 or so yards away, the lights were indistinct. The researchers made their way over to the tree to get a better look, and as they got close, one of the men pointed up to the tree and whispered, "There's something up there." At maybe 50 yards from the tree, they all came to a halt and stopped to get a better look. The tiny lights in the trees weren't lights at all, but rather bright glowing yellow eyes that illuminated a large black bird-like figure, larger than a man. It was staring straight at them from up in the tree. As they stood frozen and staring, another of the researchers pointed to the base of the tree. Circling around the trunk was another set of yellow eyes. This pair appeared to belong to some sort of wolf-like creature who was slowly pacing around the tree base and watching them as they approached. The two sets of eyes were menacing, but as the NIDS researchers shook off the shock of what they were seeing, one of them grabbed his rifle, pulled up to his cheek and aimed and shot at the bird creature up in the tree. The yellow eyes winked out and they heard something fall out of the tree. The second set of eyes had disappeared as well. They approached the tree, and as they got within a few feet, were stunned to find nothing there. They searched the entire area. There was no body, no feathers, and no blood. The only trace left behind was a couple of very large, strange footprints just below the branch they saw the creature standing on. They made molds, took photographs, and had the footprints analyzed. The closest match scientists could come up with was to a well-known dinosaur, the velociraptor. There were many instances of the NIDS team running into creatures with glowing yellow eyes across the ranch after the first initial encounter. This became quite a common occurrence in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In many cases, the team members would report being stalked by wolf-like creatures with glowing yellow eyes. In some cases, the team members were surrounded on all sides by several of these creatures. During peak activity times on the ranch, NIDS began encountering strange issues with their equipment. Every time the NIDS team attempted to capture video or photographic evidence of some of the phenomena, equipment would malfunction. Video cameras overlooking areas of interest would go blank when something strange would occur within their view. When photos were taken of floating orbs or small craft off in the distance, the objects would show up as smudges of light on the screen. In one instance, the cameras overlooking an area where activity was occurring began to cut out completely. When the team members went out to fix the cameras, they noticed that the PVC pipe containing the wiring had been broken open. The tape they used to seal the wiring had been completely removed and was nowhere to be seen, and it appeared that something had removed several feet of wiring from the inside. The researchers had full coverage of all the areas surrounding the camera just as it went out, and it was confirmed to be nothing there. Someone or something was able to mess with the camera without being seen by anyone or any of the equipment and without leaving a trace. The orange portals that the SHERMANs witnessed during their time on the ranch continued to be prevalent when the NIDS team took over. However, the NIDS team members were able to get closer looks and better views of this strange phenomenon. Late one night, two NIDS researchers were patrolling the grounds together. As they made their way back towards camp, they were coming up over a small hill when both men spotted a small orange globe floating about 100 feet in front of them. They watched as the orange globe grew in size. It seemed to pulse and quiver as it got bigger and bigger. Eventually, the orb had grown to nearly 10 feet tall and nearly equally as wide. The men made their way closer, and as they approached, they noticed that they could see something behind the orange glow. One man grabbed his binoculars and focused on the center of the orb and inside. He noticed he could see another sky behind the orange doorway. It was not the night sky they were surrounded by, but rather a bright blue sky with some light cloud coverage in what appeared to be midday. Stunned, the man explained to his fellow NIDS member what he was seeing. The other man asked for the binoculars and verified his claims. There was indeed another sky inside the orange portal. As the men watched the portal, contemplating what to do next, a set of large hands reached out of the orange doorway, appearing to grab the sides of the portal. A head appeared, then a torso, then legs, as a giant black creature pulled itself out of the portal. It was 9 feet tall, stocky, and appeared to be covered in dark hair or fur. The creature moved quickly away from where the two researchers were watching and disappeared into the trees and shrubbery in the distance. The creature left behind two traces of its presence, some footprints from where it appeared and a musty, rotten stench that lingered in the air for several minutes after it had gone. The team gathered all the evidence they could from the area. They had the footprint impressions analyzed by an expert who claimed that they appeared to be from a large ape-like animal. They were larger than any ape he was aware of, and more importantly, Utah has no ape species native to the area. The closest thing the team would come up with was when they compared their print to a similar castings taken out supposed Bigfoot or Sasquatch prints. By the early 2000s, Skinwalker Ranch activity had decreased dramatically. There were still strange sightings and odd phenomena from time to time, but the activity was far less frequent and usually on a much smaller scale. One of the final major events reported by the NIDS team occurred in 2003. One of the NIDS researchers was playing cards with one of the hired ranch hands in a trailer during the night when the air went electric. The hair on their arms, legs, and neck stood up and you could feel the electricity. almost like right before a close encounter with a lightning strike. They both ran outside to see what was happening, and up in the air above them was a small black object in the sky above their trailer. They couldn't make out the exact size or shape, but they could see a mass in the darkness. The ranch hand was unnerved by what he saw, but the NIDS researcher was completely frozen, as if in a trance staring at the object. Moments later, it vanished and everything seemed to return to normal. When the assistant asked the NIDS man what had happened, he said that the object had spoken to him in his head. It had told him that it knew why they were here, and that it was here for a similar reason. The NIDS investigator said the craft told him that they were in control and there was nothing him or his team could do to stop them. After the events in 2003, the ranch remained relatively quiet for years. Activity was at an all-time low, with sometimes more than a year passing without incident. In 2004, the NIDS team was disbanded and Robert Bigelow set up a new team by the name of Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. It is rumored that the reform was more of a rebranding in order to be able to acquire more government research funds. In 2007, an unnamed agent from the DIA contacted Bigelow and requested to visit the ranch in person. The agent apparently had a personal encounter of some sort on the property and brought this information back with him. This prompted the U.S. Congress to approve $22 million in funding for the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, most of which was given to Robert Bigelow and his team to continue their research on Skinwalker Ranch. There were numerous eyewitness reports of military helicopters on the ranch after government funding was approved, sometimes hovering over the area, other times flying low and scouring the land. Bigelow's research team continued their work on the ranch with government funding for the next 5 years. In 2012, the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program's contract ended and government funding was removed from the Bigelow team. Bigelow kept his team going with personal funds for the next few years. In 2016, Robert Bigelow sold Skinwalker Ranch to Brandon Fugel, the CEO of Adamantium Holdings. As Bigelow's security was removed from the land, Brandon's security team took over and continued to keep the ranch private and on lockdown from the public. Brandon and his team continue to investigate the phenomenon on the ranch to this day. While most of the activity on the ranch seems to have disappeared in recent times, it is speculated that there's an ebb and flow of activity in the Uinta Basin. History in the area has shown us you can go a few decades with relative silence before being hit by a wave of high strangeness. So while Skinwalker Ranch appears to be sleeping for the moment, it seems likely it will wake again. So what do you guys think about the claims of activity on Skinwalker Ranch? Is there some supernatural or alien intervention taking place? Or is there perhaps an alternative explanation? Be sure to comment below and let us know what you think. Also, feel free to let us know what other content you would like to see us cover on the channel. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like our content and want to see more, be sure to subscribe and make sure to click the bell and turn on notifications so you can be alerted anytime we post new content. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you would like to help our channel grow, spread the word and share our videos. I'm your host, Damien, and we'll see you next time on The Stranger Side.